very happy everybody was able to come tonight, and I'll give you as much information as I can in as a quick a time period as I can. I'll dive right into it. It's a fairly long, but it's short from the viewpoint of how long I spent on the slides. We're here tonight to go over the book that Paul McRae and I helped write. Put that together last year. The book's goal is to provide a quick reference to energy and climate issues with a focus on Canada, using a format based on the Heartland Institute's earlier edition, Climate at a Glance book, which is worth having a look at as well. I'm just going to focus on the first three sections, and Paul will take the last two. The book was a collaboration with 7 authors. They're listed here. The driving force was John Zacharias, along with Andrew Bomancini from Canadians for Sensible Climate Policy. Andrew was a past president of the Society. John's vision is to see this book used as a simple starting point for some real and open discussion on energy and climate issues and the outcomes. A meaningful public debate is long overdue and still plagued by aggressive censorship and ideological mis, dis, and omission information. The CSCP has a program called Pathfinders that they hope you can volunteer for as well. They will provide info and training. The hope is to educate people like yourselves and get the book into the hands of prominent members of our financial, political, journalistic, and other communities. The Heartland Institute provided the capacity to physically put the book together along with their climate expertise. The other authors, Paul McRae, Tom Harris, Robert Lyman, and their current organizational ties are shown here. As Michelle said, I'm currently the president of Friends of Science Society, and you can check our websites, which she's already given. The book starts with an introduction. I've summarized it here. We're constantly having our green initiatives pushed on us. That goes for the entire world. The costs over the last decade have been $14 trillion, and CO2 emissions have risen about 60% over that time period. So we're not doing a very good job of getting rid of those emissions. Net zero projected costs, they're as high as $400 trillion. The global temperature rise that will likely be averted, in the best case, would be 0.28 degrees centigrade. In the more theoretically correct case, it'll be 0.07 degrees. Canadian emission reduction commitments are 40 to 45% below 2005 levels for Canada by 2030. That will take us back to the 1880s, in my opinion, and not just on emission levels. Trillions of Canadian taxpayer dollars for a temperature rise reduction of, at the best, 0.007 degrees, and an annual GDP improvement somewhere in the $20 billion range. Trillions to save billions. And it's, as we said before, it's economic, environmental folly. It's all pain, no gain. Bye. Okay, section 1, the economics of Canadian climate commitments, reduction goals. The Canadian government does have a plan shown here, but like all plans, that's not how real life turns out. What they have not provided is a proper cost-benefit analysis to get there. To date, only real gains have been made in the electrical generation sector. They're down roughly 50% since 2005. Those are the cheap, easy cuts, assuming you can realistically call wind, solar, and electric vehicles, batteries, etc., cheap or easy. Now, this slide shows us what we can expect in electrical generation emission gains. The premise is obviously fossil fuels are bad and bioenergy is good. But that kind of does beg the question that aren't oil, gas, and coal also bioenergy? Employing more wind generation will be responsible for the biggest change, followed by nuclear. Natural gas still plays a role, assuming carbon capture, utilization, and storage is part of the mix, another expensive alternative. And all of these are at the expense of cheap, reliable, clean energy that natural gas and coal offer already. Canada is blessed with abundant hydro and our can-do nuclear technology, making our electrical grid one of the cleanest in the world, with 80.6% of our emissions already generation non-emitting. Combined with our huge boreal forests that act as a huge CO2 sink, capable of easily absorbing our emissions, we are not the problem, and that's assumed Series 1. Alberta itself does not have significant hydro options and has relied on our cheap, reliable, abundant, and efficient natural gas supplies for electrical generation. We have also supplemented that gas generation with wind and solar. Whether that's right or wrong, we'll find out. The chart above summarizes Alberta's wind and solar statistics from 2023. Solar efficiencies were only 21.5%. Wind was not much better at 31.1%, the average being 29%. Solar is contributing less than 25% of its nameplate capacity 67% of the time. And wind is not much better at 46% of the time. The problem, during 2023, solar and wind together were often generating no electricity for days at a time, meaning Alberta still needs a fully capable gas-oriented backup option, regardless of how much wind and solar you actually add to the system. So, is hydrogen the answer? Certainly not yet, given the cost, safety considerations, and technological improvements that are still required. So how does it make sense to take inefficient energy sources like wind and solar to produce hydrogen? It doesn't. You lose almost 70% of the original power generated getting the hydrogen to the end user. So your overall wind to hydrogen efficiency is about 10%, and solar to hydrogen efficiency is about 7.3%. Oops. Now, how much will net zero cost us? This is a graph from the 2022 budget, from the federal budget. It's going to cost us a lot. Current expenditures are in the $20 billion range per year. The 2022 budget puts future expenditures in the $140 billion per year range. That's $3.5 trillion over 25 years. Recent estimates have increased that to $5.2 trillion. Every one of those dollars will be added to the already staggering debt that we are leaving for our children and grandchildren. That's why I do this. Now, this is a graph from Volkswagen. They looked at the life cycle emissions for their diesel and EV options. I added in the new battery myself. So do EVs really contribute significantly to emission reduction? It's certainly debatable. EVs are not zero emission, they're elsewhere emission options. The same goes for Canadian oil, gas, and coal production. If Trudeau, Carney, etc. shut in our production, that production and associated emissions gets exported to other jurisdictions with lower emission ethical and environmental standards. This slide just touches on the supply chain fundamentals. We need hundreds of new mines just in North America to supply our mineral needs. Those mines won't even be approved by the time we've got our 2035 EV mandates in place. And currently China has the majority interest in most of these critical supply chains. I wonder how that is going to play out with our current tariff wars. We're not going to win those. Our current critical mineral reserves are just not enough to supply the net zero needs. And then how do we supply the next generation of wind, solar, battery development, et cetera, that's required just a couple decades from now? So just how environmentally sound is net zero? How many endangered bats, birds, whales, et cetera, deaths can we justify? How much habitat, natural and agricultural, can we justify destroying? How much damage will new mining inflict on the landscape, like with leaching ponds, open pit mining, et cetera, and societal issues like child labor in the Congo and slave labor in China? What are we going to do with the end-of-life waste? Windmills, blades, batteries, PV panels, etc. Renewables, land use dwarfs other options and are not the environmental savior they profess to be. Now we move on to section 2, Canadian emission targets. Starts off with a statement, domestic CO2 restrictions are futile and harmful for a reason. Here's Canada's historical CO2 emissions. They peaked at 2007 at 0.59 gigatons per year and have been declining at just 0.001 gigatons per year, including the COVID lockdowns, despite huge taxpayer-funded expenditures. This chart shows our current targets. Our original Paris Accord commitment was a 30% reduction from 2005 levels. In a misguided attempt to lead the world, those reductions were increased to a 40 to 45% reduction, and all by 2030. That was deemed not good enough, and the goals have morphed into net zero by 2050. Can we get to those targets? Very unlikely. Canada's current emission reduction plan only gets us part of the way there and would require drastically higher expenditures, as much as 9 times our current annual expenditures of $20 billion, and it is all debt. To get to our 2030 targets, we would have to cut emissions at 25 times the rate we have accomplished since the turn of the century. Net zero is just technically and economically not possible, in my opinion. The easy, cheap options have already been accessed. Global emission growth from Canada is negligible. We're only at 1.5% of the emissions of total of the world. As emissions grow, and they will, in China and elsewhere, our influence will just get smaller. What do you think will happen when we layer in India, which wants everything China has already and more, and Africa, which are just starting on their path of prosperity? Emissions will continue to rise dramatically independent of what Canada does. China, India, and Africa account for 54% of the planet's population and 42% of the emissions, and that's growing. Include the US, and you have 58% of the world's population and 53% of the emissions unburdened by Paris climate commitments. And you can throw Russia into that calculation as well. We cannot lead the world, nor should we, if the rest of the world is not following. So, what can we do about all those emissions, and what effect will our actions have on future temperatures? Back in 2017, Bjorn Lomborg laid out what the Paris Accord commitments would achieve. Full global compliance to Paris would achieve a temperature rise reduction of just 0.17 degrees centigrade in 2100 on expenditures in the $160 trillion range. Using the IPCC scenarios, or the IPCC science, pardon me, and an unrealistically high emission scenario, Canada's contribution, an unmeasurable 0.0026 degrees centigrade. More recent estimates based on net zero by 2050 yield similar results. Linsen, Happer, and Van Wijngaarden put the global temperature rise averted at just 0.07 degrees based on CO2's theoretical warming capacity. With the IPCC science rolled in, a 4 times factor for their unsubstantiated positive water feedbacks, the number might be as high as 0.28 degrees centigrade. Canada's equivalent share of those numbers is just 0.001 to 0.004 C. Ross McKittrick, a Canadian academic, has estimated the averted temperature at a generous 0.007 degrees centigrade. Another measure of net zero success would be its economic input. These plots show our GDP and GDP per capita performance, both historical and predicted. Canadian GDP has been trending down for a long time and has leveled out in the sub 2% range. How have we fared against our peer group, the OECD? Since 2014, we are third last in the OECD with an anemic 0.6% annual growth rate. Our projected growth rates to 2060 are even worse, last place at 0.78% annually. The unfunded green expenditures are a major contributing factor to both our poor recent historical GDP growth and our dismal future prospect. That needs to change. Hopefully it will shortly. The chart on the right summarizes a report put out by the Federal Parliamentary Budget Office in November 2022. That report stated that the consequences of climate change would reduce our GDP growth by 6.6% in the year 2100. So instead of growing 378% at 2% a year, we would only grow 371%, a GDP drop of 140 billion, significant but not exactly an emergency. The PBO also did a run with full global Paris compliance. That would reduce the climate change damage to just 5.8% from 6.6%. That 0.8% difference amounts to a GDP improvement of just $17 billion in 2100, 80 years from now. How many trillions do you think we should spend to save that $17 billion? Bjorn Lomborg has done a similar analysis, coming up with a similar climate change cost of 7.1%. Both estimates are based on the implausibly high RCP 8.5 emission scenario. The cost-benefit analysis is pretty straightforward based on the PBO report. We are spending $2.4 trillion, that's discounted at 3%, a standard economic parameter, to save $124 billion. Literally spending trillions to save billions. And somehow our ex-leader and his potential replacements, it's not a potential now, it's Mark Carney, still see a business case for net zero. The chart is a bit complicated, but essentially the area below the red expenditures and above the black curve are those wasted trillions. Now we get into section 3, the section I wanted to write, because it's what I spent most of my life writing about, but we left that to the Heartland Institute. It's a look at climate science. And I'll sprinkle in a few of my other charts that didn't make it into the book just for a little more color. The lower left chart shows how insignificant human contributions are to CO2 emissions. CO2 is a trace gas at just 0.042% of the atmosphere and is just 0.0012% of the atmospheric greenhouse gases. The chart to the right is the global temperature and CO2 concentrations over the Phanerozoic, the last 570 plus million years. CO2 and temperature do not correlate over this period. Neither one is driving the other on this time scale. There's other factors in play. Current CO2 levels, 425 parts per million, are still close to historical lows at 180 parts per million and dangerously close to extinction levels. On this planet, all life dies when we reach 150 parts per million. That's where we're headed for probably a couple million years from now, but still significant. Now, the climate hysteria is based primarily on computer models that are self-acknowledged to run way too hot, and they still use implausibly high emission scenarios. That would be any scenario above SSP to 4.5. The 4.5 is watts per meter, the heating parameter. All 36 IPCC models run too hot, well above satellite, weather balloon, and reanalysis data. So how does averaging out a whole lot of individual projections that are all wrong, considered right, and ultimately the science? I added one of my own graphs upper right to show how out to lunch the Canadian models are, and they're not alone. The blue curve is based on a realistic emission scenario, still well above the actual observed data. And the purple curve is based on the 8.5 fantasy scenario. The red curve there shows, it comes from the Russians, and they're using the 4.5 emission scenario. That has a reasonable match with the over-homogenized Hadcroot 5 surface data, but they're still noticeably above the satellite data from the University of Alabama, Huntsville, and NOAA STAR satellite data sets. Essentially, computer modeling 101, garbage in, garbage out, and that's what I think you have with all of these billion-dollar models they put out. Now, here's a slide showing a sadly typical weather station. This slide shows an example of a poorly designed weather station. It's a parking lot in the University of Arizona in Tucson. There are a lot more of them, and the temperatures here will obviously be exaggerated higher by the heat release from the pavement and just the urban heat island effect in general. Most stations are non-compliant. They're called class 3, 4, and 5, and have very large error ranges, but they're still being used. The chart compares those different classes. Class 1 and 2 stations have a significantly lower trend than either the non-compliant stations or the homogenized data that NOAA puts out. No, 30 years does not represent a climate trend. It just compares the data. Now, every extreme weather event is portrayed by evidence of climate change by our ideological politicians and their minions in the media. Or the weather was made worse by climate change, courtesy of the attribution studies that still use the climate models that run way too hot. So what do these charts say? The IPCC and empirical data tell us that these tables are pulled from the IPCC's AR6 report, table 1212. Now, the blank cells are not a mistake. What that tells us, and what the IPCC does not see, is any trends impacting wet, dry, or wind conditions in the historical data. It's a little bit different than what you hear in the news. They do see more precipitation in the future, despite the fact that we're all going to burn up. But the precipitation rise is based on the implausibly high RCP 8.5 emission scenario. So it's very doubtful that will ever come to pass. Now, the empirical data up in the upper right is tropical storm and hurricane frequency, which confirms that there is no statistically significant trend visible in the data. Although the trend does go down slightly, just not statistically significant. And no, the acreage burnt in forest fires has not been rising globally, the upper right plot, or in general locally. The Canadian wildfire chart used in the book does not show the record high acreage burnt in 2023. That was 18.5 million hectares. I added the lower chart with the 2023 numbers and CO2 concentration to show the correlation with Canadian forest fire statistics. There is no correlation. The record high 18.5 million hectares is not a response to CO2 any more than the 2020 record low of 230,000 hectares was. And I would guess that none of you heard about that in your news feeds. The Canadian trend, far more important than one anomalous year, is statistically flat. The 2024 season will come in around 5.4 million hectares, still high, but not unexpected given the anomalously high temperatures experienced during 2023 and 2024. Now, those temperature increases have little to nothing to do with CO2. I'm not going to get into that discussion here. Right. Sea levels have been generally rising for thousands of years out of the last glacial minimum. But that rise has been interrupted many times over the Holocene warm period, which we are thankfully living through right now. The alarmist community likes to focus on just 1960 to the present period to show that sea level rise has been accelerating. That statement is true, but that ignores the same acceleration from 1900 to 1960. It ignores the long-term linear trend consistent with just about every tide gauge on the planet, and totally ignores the declining sea levels pre-1850s. How does the sea level decline when CO2 concentrations are virtually flat? It has nothing to do with CO2. Note, CO2 and sea level change do not correlate, one of the themes through the paper. The deceleration and accelerations are in the data conveniently line up with the ocean cycles, warming and cooling, which is what's really moving that sea level. The inflection point in the 1850s is due to forcings much stronger than either CO2 and or the ocean cycles. That would be the sun. And we are not destined to burn in hell, at least not based on historical temperature data. 8 of the 10 Canadian provinces recorded their hottest temperatures prior to 1940, consistent with the US, which is not shown here. The dirty 30s were real, as shown in the chart above. The warmest temperatures, longest warm spells, and the heat wave index were all significantly more severe than our current conditions. The 1930 temperatures have been homogenized out of existence. That means they've been data manipulation. I'm sure that would provide some significant relief for those that lived and died through that period. And yes, the Pacific Northwest heat dome was hot, but that was localized. That's not what you hear in the news. The global average in early July 2021 was just 0.2 degrees centigrade higher than the 1979 to 2000 base numbers. So not exactly a climate emergency. This is one of my graphs. This chart shows CO2 concentrations and various global temperatures plotted to reflect the alarmist narrative that CO2 is responsible for virtually all global warming since the pre-industrial era, 1950. The pre-1850 Holocene CO2 concentrations were virtually flat, yet somehow temperatures fluctuated significantly with no CO2 contribution. Natural forcings, which would be primarily solar, directly or indirectly, have been acting on our planet over this period, but somehow have nothing to do with recent temperature rise or our future climate. Why did temperatures start rising out of the Little Ice Age centuries before CO2 in both hemispheres? Why did half the temperature rise from the pre-industrial era occur pre-1950, when 86% plus of humanity's emissions occurred post-1950? These are questions that don't get asked. So there's a lot more to climate change than just greenhouse gases and or CO2. The oceans are not becoming acidic. They are caustic, with pHs ranging from 7.8 to 8.5 and averaging 8.1.
What?
pHs may drop slightly lower as CO2 rises, but they will not become acidic based on humanity's limited CO2 emission capabilities. And including more CO2 will likely be very beneficial. Like plants on land, phytoplankton thrives at higher CO2 concentrations, boosting the ocean ecosystem, not harming it. This is another one of my charts. This chart consolidates a range of extreme weather empirical data sets on one chart by normalizing the data. Only the trend lines are shown, but those trend lines show that obviously extreme weather is going down as CO2 goes up. The original data can be found at the links shown on the chart. Number 1 corresponds to the maximum event parameters and 0 to the minimum. The main takeaway, extreme weather events, fire, drought, storms, flooding, are headed lower or are statistically flat while CO2 rises. Our ideological leaders and media minions are either outright lying to the odds-on favorite, in my opinion, or are ignorant to the empirical data. Now, the alarmist narrative has proclaimed that global warming is an existential threat. Absolutely not true. Cheap, reliable, and abundant hydrocarbons have made our environment safe, dropping climate-related deaths by 95+% since the early 20th century. And that's no easy task, given, according to Alex Epstein, the Earth is not a naturally nurturing, delicate balance, but rather a naturally, 1, dynamic, 2, deficient, and 3, dangerous place. And one more for the hotter temperatures will kill us all crowd. Cold kills an order of magnitude more people than heat does. 10 times as many deaths are from cold weather. Does that mean that many more people will be saved than lost should temperature rise? Yeah, it does. So we don't need to fear warming. Hydrocarbon energy sources allow us to fight both significantly hotter and colder conditions. Renewables alone will significantly increase our survival risk regardless of which extreme or even mild temperatures we are exposed to in the future. This is the book summary for section 1 to 3. I've taken out the key points in my opinion. Canada's global emission contribution is an insignificant 1.5%. Canadians are spending trillions, 3.4 to 5.2, to save billions, which peaked at about 20 billion in 2100. Achieving global net zero ambitions will reduce the temperature rise by 0.28 degrees centigrade in the best case with the IPCC science. Canada's share just 0.004 degrees centigrade. Extreme weather events in general are not getting stronger or more frequent globally. The climate models are self-acknowledged to run way too hot and are still using implausibly high emission scenarios, and supply chains cannot meet the net zero mandates. Wind, solar, EVs, batteries, etc. are not environmentally, ethically, or socially benign. Hydrocarbons have allowed our society to develop and survive on a planet that is not intrinsically safe for the hairless apes that we are. We are not technologically or economically ready for an energy transition. CO2 is a minor driver at best. Natural forcings did not stop acting just because CO2 is rising and the IPCC declared it to be so. There is no climate emergency, crisis, etc., certainly not from warming. And I'll just finish off with this slide. The global warming alarmist climate science platform is just a narrative based on very little science, supported by computer models that are self-acknowledged to run way too hot and use implausibly high emission scenarios. They're based on an all CO2 all the time hypothesis that has no empirical data backing it up, which is a very basic scientific method requirement. And they depend on the lie that extreme weather events are getting stronger and more frequent. That's the three pillars they stand on, and they're all broken. CO2 has very little impact on climate, despite the propaganda to the contrary. Greenland, Antarctic, and pre-Holocene temperatures, there's minimal CO2 influence. Global sea levels, GDP growth, future temperature reductions, again, minimal CO2 influence. Extreme weather events are declining while CO2 concentrations are rising. The CO2 climate sensitivities being used are too high and definitely not settled science. And the very obvious solar forcings continue to be ignored. Emission reduction policies is having and will continue to have a devastating effect on our children and grandchildren's future. Debt, inflation, lower standards of living, just to name a few. All that is laid out in my CSS 53, it's a climate short story. CO2's Moneyball moment. If CO2 is such a good climate driver, why doesn't it drive climate good? Thank you all for your time. I hope you got some information out of that. Thanks.